This is episode 359 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is powered by our patrons. Patrons can access insider extras, including detailed show notes that go with the episode that you're listening to, all available on patreon.com/That Shakespeare Life. Sign up today and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Dawn Tucker, Executive Director of Flagstaff Shakespeare Festival. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Well, this is because in the medieval period, there was actually a distinction between these two things. So the will was basically a document that dealt with real property, which means land, and the testament dealt with personal property. So that was possessions.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
A last will and testament is a document listing out the instructions for how to handle your remaining worldly goods after your death. It's an opportunity for the living to share their wishes from beyond the grave. In As You Like It, Orlando mentions this practice by saying, "Give me the poor allottery my father left me by testament. With that I will go buy my fortunes." In Julius Caesar, the group cries out, "The will, the testament!" Again, in Timon of Athens, the painter says, "Performance is a kind of will or testament, which argues a great sickness in his judgment that makes it." Obviously, Shakespeare's making a metaphorical statement in that last use of will and testament, but the references here declare a history to documenting one's final wishes and the process of carrying out your bequests. Here today to help us explore what wills and testaments were like for the 16th and 17th century, who it was that wrote them, what these wills and testaments included, as well as the details of Shakespeare's own will and testament, is our guest and expert in the history of wills and testaments from the 16th all the way to the 19th century, Laura Sangha. Laura Sangha is an associate professor of early modern history at the University of Exeter, a historian of English religious cultures in the Long Reformation from 1450 to 1700, and is currently co-investigator on the Leverhulme project, The Material Culture of Wills, England from 1540 to 1790, where the project team are working with volunteers to transcribe, analyze, and make freely available 25,000 wills. You can learn more about Laura, her publications, and her projects at the links in the show notes for today's episode. Before we get into the conversation today, I want to remind you that there's coordinating visual history content about wills and testaments, including pictures of some of the documents and bequests and strange lists that people provided, all of the legal stuff. We've got pictures of that from the digital archive that are included in the bonus content for patrons of our show. You can look at these images and explore some of the primary documents and other research tidbits related to our conversation today while you're listening to the show by clicking on the Patreon button on our show notes page. All of the extras will expand right on the website when you log in or join us using that same button, all on the website. The show notes URL for this week is CassidyCash.com/episode 359. You can go there now to sign up or stay tuned after the episode when I'll be back to give you this URL again. And now let's dive into the history. Hello, Laura. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Thank you.
What is the difference between a will and a testament? And why do we always call it a will and testament?
Well, this is because in the medieval period, there was actually a distinction between these two things. So the will was basically a document that dealt with real property, which means land, and the testament dealt with personal property. So that was possessions. But that distinction, even in the medieval period, wasn't necessarily very closely observed. And by the early modern period, that phrase, the last will and testament, came into general usage to describe a legal document that disposed of either land or possessions or both. So basically, the two just got amalgamated and it became one thing.
What sorts of documents are you looking into when you say you're examining wills? I know on the University of Exeter's website, I saw references to phrases like probate records or testamentary documents or even parish records in one case. Are there all different kinds of documents you're looking at that fall under the heading of wills?
Yeah, so the word will itself usually only refers to the last will and testament, but there are different kinds or different versions of wills that you can come across. So for the research project that I'm involved with, we're actually not looking at original wills. So an original will is probably what you imagine when you think of an old legal document. It's a kind of time-aged single sheet of paper. It might well have been folded up and then perhaps it was tied together. Often they're tied together with ribbons and then they're kind of put in boxes and put into the archive. That's a kind of original will. But then what we're working with on the project is not these originals, but actually copies of those originals, which have been made by a church court clerk who is copying out the will basically as part of the process of the will going through the legal process of probate and being proved by the court. And the clerk is copying that original will into what is effectively a massive book, which is known as a register. So it's just a huge book with loads and loads of copies of wills in it. And those registered copies of wills and the originals are actually housed at the National Archives in the UK. And those are the ones that we're looking at. So those original wills you can go and look at in person, but the registered copies of wills are the ones that have actually been digitized. So if you do go onto the National Archive website and look at wills, you're actually looking not at the original will, but a copy that is one that appears in the registers. So as well as these originals and copies of wills, there are also other documents that are generated as part of this process of a will going through probate. So if a will named executors, so that is the person or the people chosen by the testator to carry out the will, those executors first had to take that will to court where they would be granted probate, and that basically legally empowered them to administer the will. So often on a registered will, there might be a note in the margin, usually in Latin, which would explain who had been appointed as the executor. However, if a person died intestate, so if they died without having made a will, or if the executor for some reason wasn't able to take on the role, what they would do is that the court would appoint somebody else who was responsible for ministering the will. And that person would be given letters of administration by the court, and they'd become the administrator of the will. So one of the other records that you can sometimes find are these letters of administration. And then for probate to be granted to either the executor or the administrator, they also had to do something else, which was that they had to take an inventory of the dead person's personal possessions and property. And it had to be valued by a competent person. So what we're talking about here is basically a list of everything that the person owned. Very often what they do is they actually just go into their house and then they go room by room and they say, in the kitchen, we found all of these things and they were worth this. In the parlour, we found these and they were worth this. And they sort of do that for every room in the house. So they're really evocative if you're interested in what was in people's houses and what they're doing in different rooms and how a house is changing and so on. So those inventories had to be taken by the administrator or the executor, and they were taken to court. And then when you're granted probate, you also take the inventory with you. The problem is those inventories aren't necessarily kept in one place. So sometimes you might find a copy of an inventory with a will in the church court records or our church court archive. Other times they might be in sort of personal papers, or they might be in the papers of a solicitor or something like that. And the final probate-related document are probate accounts. So these are accounts which are presented to the court by the executor or the administrator, usually about a year after probate is granted and but definitely after the estate has been settled. So what it is like a kind of financial record, and it lists the original inventory total, so the total value of the estate. It then lists how the estate has been settled, so all of the debts that have been paid off, all of the bequests that have been paid out, and so on in the course of carrying out the last person's will. And then it ends with the remainder So what is left after all of those debts and bequests have been paid? And that remainder is then basically the property or the money which is distributed to the heir. So you have to settle the person's affairs first, and then you can distribute the estate.
Who was it that would prepare a final will and testament for someone? Would an individual like Shakespeare, for example, would he sit down and write down his own wishes onto a piece of paper, or was the physical writing of it hired out to a lawyer or one of these clerks that you're mentioning that would be ferrying stuff back and forth to the court?
Yeah. Well, interestingly, actually anyone could write a will. There was no sort of qualification that was needed or anything like that. So some people did write their own wills. But of course, it was dependent on you being well enough to do so. So you might be sick and unwell and not able to do that. And of course, it would also depend on you being literate and being able to read and write. So in the 16th century, I'm sure you know, only a minority of the population can read and write. And particularly, literacy is closely tied to social status and gender. So it's more likely that you'll be able to write your own will if you're wealthier and if you're male. As a matter of fact, in the 16th century, wills are most often, we think, written by the local clergyman, because he's somebody who would definitely be literate and he might well be visiting the sick person to provide spiritual ministry to them. And this was particularly the case in smaller rural communities and in villages, which is where most people lived. And the clergyman there at the beginning of the 16th century might have been the only person that could read and write. So naturally, they were the person that did it. You could pay somebody to make your will. So you could pay a professional. That would be a lawyer or perhaps a scribe, so someone who made their living writing documents. But most people didn't seem to do that. And in towns, and particularly as time went on, the will writer was most often a friend or a neighbour, so anyone that could write and that was nearby. And generally, people seem to have quite a good knowledge of what they should include. So they knew how to write the will. They knew what phrases to include. They knew how to make sure that everything was really clear and would be followed. So I think probably what is happening is that people were witnessing wills, so they were getting a good experience of what these documents should look like, and then that was getting replicated. In some cases, though, death might come upon a person very suddenly, and it might be that in such a case you didn't have time to make a will or to find somebody with paper and a pen and to get everything done properly. But in those circumstances, people did have the option of making a nuncupative will, which is an oral will. So basically, they could just state their wishes in front of a witness. And later on, if those last wishes were written down, that would count as a legal will and it could be taken to court and then proved in court. And this is, I think, very important because what we do have is sometimes we have wills that are written during times of plague, and you definitely get things where people know, they've been infected, they know they're very likely to die. So what they do is they just speak to people who are standing outside of the room and they say, this is what I would like to happen. And those people can then write that down and that should be carried out. And we have examples where people are kind of saying that in the will, that this was taken as I stood outside the room and that person was talking to me. There's even a case where somebody is stood on a wall outside a first floor window so that they can just hear what the person is saying and then get everything written down.
What kind of paper are these wills written upon? And is it the same kind of paper that would have been used for like scripts or letters? This feels very hurried. If someone's standing outside of the room, they would have had to go grab something that was nearby. So what kind of paper is nearby in someone's house to just grab and start writing this on?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think the paper that people are using can vary quite a lot. So obviously, if you'd employed a scribe or a lawyer, then they would probably bring good quality paper with them. And that could be quite fancy. But most of the time, people are probably using things which are to hand, which they might be using as part of their business, or as you say, something which could possibly have become a letter, but is now getting repurposed so that it can be used for the will. So the nature and quality of the paper probably would be the same as other letters, correspondence, and things like that. But in other cases, it is just whatever is to hand. So I did come across an example which actually looked like it had probably been torn out of an account book. So it was a ragged sheet of paper, and it also had lines drawn on it, so columns, which looked like they were there to put figures into. And what also seemed to suggest this was that the scribe had run out of space because it wasn't a very large sheet of paper. And they'd ended up having to get another scrap of paper, which had then been stitched, like literally stitched to the bottom of the page using a needle and thread in order to then write out the extra bit so that they could include everything that they needed to. And that was a will that was written during a plague year. So it very strongly suggests that, grabbing whatever was nearest to hand and then making do.
I'm really curious now to go and look into whether Shakespeare's will was written on the same kind of paper that his plays would have been written on. I really, for some reason, that's just a curiosity question of mine now. Is that what he had to hand there for him? I think that's an interesting question. Do you know?
I don't know. I don't know what his scripts were written on. And I imagine that the paper that his will was written on probably was relatively posh, as I think of it, because his lawyer was involved in writing the will. So it seemed like it was a very professional setup and not necessarily something that was hurried.
I saw a documentary on the will of Lady Margaret Capel. I hope I'm pronouncing her last name correctly, but her bequests provided key information in the murder mystery of the Princes in the Tower. And in that documentary, the will that they are exploring surprised me. It's from 1522, but it's huge. It's not just a book, but I mean, it is massive. I mean, at least probably close to a foot from the table, up. It was huge. And I just wonder, was it typical for wills to be of considerable length and to also be bound? Because this book was bound with a leather strap and a buckle. It looked like it was meant to last. I'm just wondering, you're mentioning personal wills are usually folded and tied with a ribbon and put in a box. So this seemed contrary to that. Why was this so different?
So it sounds to me like that was probably a will register. So It was a copy of the will that had been copied out into this book. And the registers are precisely like that. They're absolutely enormous, sort of, I guess, a foot or something like that, tall, huge leather covers, big buckles, and then very nice handwriting inside it. Of course, it's all written by a professional scribe. So that's probably what that was. It wasn't just a single will. It was actually lots and lots of wills, but it was the volume that particular will was in. But original wills themselves, I mean, they do vary a lot in terms of their size and how formal they are. So some of them would be large, fancy scrolls of paper. They might well have had wax seals on them as well as a signature. And some of those can run to sort of 10 or 20 pages. But others might be something that's very short. So particularly a non-cooperative will, sometimes they can just be 2 or 3 sentences and it'll just be one sheet of paper. So it would really depend. It would depend on how much property you owned and how many possessions you had and how much you had to kind of detail the different things that were going to different people. And it could also depend quite a lot on what I think of as the caveats or the sort of conditional clauses that people were adding to their wills. So many people in their will are trying to plan for a future that is quite uncertain. So they might leave their property to their eldest son, but then they would add a clause about what should happen if that son had actually died before the testator. And then perhaps even another caveat saying, and if that son had died, then in fact, what I would like to have happen is something different. So you could actually be putting, you'd have a bequest, but there'd be several different parts to it. And obviously, the more of that you did, the longer that your will was going to get.
And for listeners who are using meters instead of feet, a foot is about a third of a meter. So for reference there, that's the size that we're talking about. Now, you've talked about how these wills are wrapped in ribbon and stored in a box, and that's how they're stored as you're doing your research, or the digitized ones or the register books are how they're stored for now. But when somebody was in the 16th century, what were 16th century wills a matter of public record then, or were they private and sealed away somewhere for the family or kept with their lawyer? I think you mentioned the church archives might house them. What happened to them? We've finished, we've processed the will, everyone's gotten what they were supposed to be bequeathed, and now we still have this paper. Where did it get put?
Yeah, so that can vary. So for the original wills, often they are kept in the same place as the copies of the wills, but not always. And one of the things that you can see or you'll have realized is happening is that people are making lots of copies of wills. So there would be different versions of it. And one of those might end up in private archive, family papers. There will always be a copy, the registered copy, which is part of the court archive. But there might also be other versions of the will for various reasons that people wanted copies of it. So the registered wills definitely were intended to be public records, and they have been very widely consulted. So I talked to Ruth Selman, who's an early modern record specialist at the National Archive, and she said that these registers were basically a means of allowing the wills to be continually accessed and continually consulted by the public. And indeed, that they've just been used really extensively. And in fact, they're probably the most consulted type of historic record. And there's lots of people that might be interested in looking at them. So initially, it might well be lawyers or people who were perhaps contesting the will and wanted to have another look at it or make sure that it had all been carried out correctly. But later on, very quickly, you start to get people who are interested in tracing their genealogy, looking at them. You've got people doing heraldry that want to see them, antiquarians, anyone looking at sort of family trees and family history. Of course, later on, again, historians start to look at them and kind of really value the sort of personal detail and insight that they provide. And these days, it's certainly family historians that consult them very extensively. And one of the reasons why wills have been digitized by the National Archive is because so many people want to look at them and to read them.
It helps preserve them and make them more widely accessible at the same time.
Yeah, that's right.
Did an individual have to sign their final will and testament?
It was actually only in 1677 that signing your will was made a legal requirement by a statute of frauds. So before that, you didn't legally have to sign your will, but in reality, most people did if they were able. That said, of course, many of them wouldn't have been fully literate. So you find that people do just put their initials. So the scribe will write their name and they'll just put their initials next to it. Some people do just make a classic mark. So a cross is the absolute classic way to sign your will. But we also have some really nice examples where people are drawing little symbols, which are a bit more personalized. And often they're linked to occupational identity. So what you get is a tailor who might draw a pair of scissors, or a farmer who's drawing a little pitchfork. And there are cases of blacksmiths who depict a horseshoe representing their trade. So there's obviously a bit of a sense that people, even people who can't write, want to leave a kind of personal mark and to show that it was them that put their name to it.
You heard it here. Signing your name with an X is historically based. So if you've seen that in films and you've been wondering, there you go. Some people did have to sign their name that way. Now, what precautions were taken to make sure the person who was making a will was actually giving these instructions, as well as to be sure that the instructions weren't changed later, particularly in the case that you mentioned of someone who's relaying their information orally? How did they make sure that the person writing it down wrote it down honestly?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think the main way to ensure that the will was an accurate record of the testator's wishes was that they had to kind of declare it at the start of the document. And they were doing that in front of witnesses. So the making of the will, there wouldn't have just been the testator and the scribe present. There would also have been other people that would be seeing what was happening and then could be called on to say, yes, this was a genuine document. And the declaration that's made at the start of the will is called the preamble. And it's very formulaic. So it's worded in such a way as to try to make it watertight. So it almost always will confirm that the testator is of a sound mind. And actually, William Shakespeare's will is a really good example of a classic preamble. So I can quote from it for you. It says, "I, William Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon, gentleman, in perfect health and memory, God be praised, do make and ordain this my last will and testament in manner and form following." So what that preamble is doing is confirming that these are the wishes of the named testator, and most importantly, that they're mentally competent when they set it down. So very often people say, I'm sick of body, but my mind is healthy. So I am in a competent state to make my will. Now, having said that, there are a good number of court records that show that wills are often disputed. So people don't always accept the validity of a will. And family and friends might contest particular clauses or arrangements and instructions. They may question the testator's state of mind when they made the will. They might suggest undue influence. So they might say that a witness or a scribe had influenced what was actually included in the will, or had prompted them to include certain things. So there were various reasons why you might end up with a dispute over a will. And the other thing that makes a difference is the fact that the legal context is actually quite complicated. So you have people making wills, but they're doing that within a context where there are customary legal rules that actually dictate transmission of property after a person's death. So there are these kind of unwritten rules which you have to follow. Confusingly, further confusing matters is the fact that customary rules can vary a lot from place to place. So in London, you might have quite different customary rules to somewhere in the north. So if you didn't know these rules, you might end up with a will that actually contradicted the customary laws. And if that happened, it leaves the will open to a legal challenge from people after the testator has died.
Now, you mentioned earlier that it was much more likely for a wealthy man to be literate than for a poor woman to be literate. So I'm assuming that there are definitely more wills written by men than by women. But did women write wills as well on occasion?
Yeah, so both men and women do make wills, but it is the case that men are much more likely to do so. And that's actually because of contemporary English property law. So to explain how it works, on marriage, under the system of coverture in England, a woman's legal status is basically transformed by her getting married. And the husband and wife effectively become one person in the eyes of the law. So in effect, what happens is that the legal status of the woman is suspended and she no longer has any independent right to own property or to make a contract. So what that means is that once a woman gets married, she doesn't really have any purpose, or she doesn't have any reason to make a will. It's her husband's job. He's in charge of and in control of the property. So for that reason, many of the wills that are made by women are actually made by single women or by widows who do own property and therefore do have things to bequeath. So occasionally you might get a will made by a married woman because they can independently own property. So they might be bequeathed property once they are married, which wouldn't necessarily just automatically become the husband's. So you do get wills from married women, but even they have to get the permission of their husband in order to make a will. So they can't just choose to go away and do it. They have to get explicit permission from their husband in order to do that, which again means that you get far fewer of them.
So when Shakespeare is leaving his second best bed to Anne Hathaway, does she get to keep that? I mean, is she allowed to own that?
Yeah, she does. So if you bequeath something to a woman in a will, it does become her personal property. And there are various ways in which a woman can own property, which kind of get around this. But generally, as a rule, they really don't. It's the husband's to control.
So what kinds of items were bequeathed? We made a distinction earlier between land and personal property, and we learned that that gets meshed together in the will and testament. But as you're going through the wills and in your research, what are some of the items that were most often bequeathed to people?
Yeah, so there's a huge variety of things that people are leaving. And it's really interesting because they're often much smaller, much less valuable than the sorts of things that would get included in a will these days. So alongside bequests of land and buildings and so on, you get really common bequests like expensive items of domestic household stuff. So that would include furniture like beds, cupboards, stools, tables, chairs, chests, all sorts of things like that. There's also a lot of textiles. So textiles are another very expensive item, quite high value. And that category could include clothes. So you might bequeath items of clothing to different people, but also tablecloths, wall hangings, bed linen, curtains, anything like that would be in your house. Then you've got other valuables. So silver plate, jewelry, coins, perhaps books, tools of the trade, things like that. Lots of kitchenware, and I'm always really happy to see kitchenware in our wills. So you get pans and skillets and ladles, glasses, cutlery, all sorts of things, which I just find to be very evocative of the kind of what was going on inside people's houses. You might get livestock being bequeathed, foodstuffs. I did come across examples of people bequeathing each other flitches of bacon, which I think is dried kind of lumps of bacon, which is a very, it seems a very strange thing to be leaving to somebody. And you've got items of, particularly later on, so in the 17th and 18th century, you get what we think of as items of conspicuous consumption. So these are things like looking glasses or mechanical clocks, bird cages, musical instruments, and so on. And increasingly, you also start to see global goods, so goods which are coming in from colonial territories like tea, coffee, sugar, ceramics, cotton, things like that.
It's impressive to think what someone felt was important enough to put someone's name on it. This lump of bacon has to go to my brother, John.
Yeah.
What's the wildest accusation, or I guess most odd item that you've seen someone bequeath in 16th and 17th century wills?
That's a really hard question because the bequests can be really unusual and really strange. So I have seen somebody bequeath, not bequeath, but mention the fact that he'd already had his tombstone made and that it was waiting and ready in his house and could it please be used. So that was relatively unusual.
He was highly prepared. That is an extremely type A person right there. That's what that
Yes, indeed. Yes. He wasn't leaving anything to chance.
No.
But but I thought I'd give you a very nice example from 1603, which was from the will of William Radcliffe, who lived in London. And he was bequeathing his sister a gold ring with a picture of a death's head. Now, this isn't that unusual, actually. This might sound a bit strange, but this was very usual for the time. So this is a little ring with a engraving of a skull on it. And these death's head rings are really common in wills because basically they are a reminder to the person that receives it, both of their deceased friend. So it's a bit of a memorial for them, but also it's a reminder of their own mortality and an invitation to sort of reflect on that and be prepared for death. So it kind of fits in with a broader religious culture and way of thinking about the afterlife at the time. So it wasn't unusual to leave a gift like this. But William specified that he was giving his sister this ring for all her unkindness. So this is actually not a nice bequest at all. And seemingly, William did not have a good relationship with his sister and was basically saying, you can have this skull. And, it's a bit of a nasty exchange, basically. So we often think of wills as, it's a way to sort of, leave things to people and have a kind of, give people something to represent the friendship that you've had in life and things like that. But it isn't always the case that that's what's going on.
Final stab and insult at your sister. If that's not sibling life, I don't know what is. Now you mentioned livestock would be bequeathed, but if you were bequeathing animals, did you often include care instructions as well? Or were there ever like pets that were given from one person to another?
Yeah, I think this is a bit early for us to see pets, but because most of the animals up here are livestock. So it's kind of cows, pigs and sheep and things like that. But having said that, they do sometimes, so they wouldn't give instructions about how to care for them because they're farm animals, but they do sometimes give you a bit of detail about these animals, which seems quite insightful. So they might specify the age or the maturity of an animal. They might say specifically, I want to leave my godson a lamb or a gelding or a yearling or something like that. When it comes to horses and cows, often they mention the colour or the kind of patterning of the hide. This usually seems like it because it's a good way to identify an animal. So I leave you the grey mare, or I leave you my sparked cow, which is a kind of dappling. So they're quite evocative. But my favourite is when you find cows and horses and they tell you their names. So we do have some cows named Daisy, which in England is a classic cow's name. I don't know if it is for you as well. But we also had a cow called Taggle, which is just a kind of unusual but obviously very affectionate name, which is rather nice.
That's fantastic. What a fun thing to discover. I'm just glad to know that they named some of their cows. That's lovely. Shakespeare's will famously includes a bequest of his second best bed to his wife, Anne Hathaway. What other notable bequests are in Shakespeare's will?
Well, Shakespeare's will is quite a business-like document, and it mostly deals with the distribution of various property and lands. So it's a bit disappointing. It's not that personal, but it's actually really typical for the male head of a reasonably well-off family. So again, to understand this, it's important to remember that there are basically customary rules which dictate the inheritance of property. So the purpose of a will is for a testator to lay down how his non-inheritable property is going to be distributed after death. So Shakespeare's widow Anne actually automatically had customary dower rights to a third of her husband's land during her natural life. So she may not appear very prominently in the will, but it's likely that she's already been provided for by these customary rules. So there's no need to mention her in her will. And again, many other wills don't mention wives particularly prominently because other arrangements are already in place. So Shakespeare's will actually is mainly focused on his heirs, but Shakespeare has 2 daughters and no male heir. So by custom, what would actually happen is that his estate would be divided between his 2 daughters. That's just what happens automatically. Shakespeare didn't want that to happen, though, so he actually uses his will to stop his estate being divided up. And he wills that his eldest daughter, Susanna, should get all of his property and land. And his younger daughter, Judith, is bequeathed cash instead. Shakespeare also left money to Joan Hart, his sister, and to her 3 sons. And he gave her the right to continue renting the Henley Street cottage where she actually lived already. And she was given the right to stay there until her death. Interestingly, he also bequeathed Joan all of his clothes. Obviously, she wasn't going to be wearing his clothes, but clothes are very valuable.
I imagine her sons probably.
Yeah, actually, I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, I was thinking, I wish she could sell them because there's a big secondhand market at the time, so she'd easily be able to sell them on. But yeah, absolutely, she could then be passing them on to her sons. But yeah, so it's clear from these bequests and this attention that the chief purpose of Shakespeare's will is basically to secure the future of his close relatives, and most of those are women, so his 2 daughters and his sister. There are a few more personal bequests, though. So that included actually the infamous second best bed to his wife, Anne. This is actually a really sentimental and valuable bequest, I think. So the best bed would have gone to Susanna as an heirloom, and it would have gone along with New Place, which is obviously the big house where they live. But New Place is a grand house and it has 10 bedrooms. So the second best bed would still have been a prestigious item, and possibly it was even the marriage bed. So it may have had that emotional resonance as well. And describing something as the second best bed, of course, sounds quite derogatory to us, but it's a really common way that people are describing things in wills. So we have loads of examples of people bequeathing friends and relatives, and usually, beloved friends, second best clothes. So my second best petticoat, or my third best set of hose, trousers, my hat, that kind of thing. And we even have a vicar in 1605 who bequeaths various different people his best gown, his second best gown, his worser gown, and his worst cloak. So, it's not unusual for these kinds of descriptions to be found. Shakespeare also leaves a couple of other personal gifts. So he leaves a silver bowl to his younger daughter, Judith, and he leaves money to a number of friends, instructing them to buy rings. So this included his lawyer, Francis Collins, various Stratford friends, and 3 of the King's men who also got money to buy rings. So that was John Hemming, Richard Burbage, and Henry Condell. And most of those were given about 26 shillings to do this, which is around £175 in today's money. So they were quite high value rings. It would have been quite prestigious. And what this basically is a request for them to have mourning rings made. So this was commemorative jewellery. It would have been made specifically after a person died, and it would have been worn on the finger, obviously, a kind of constant reminder of the person. Often they had the testator's initials engraved in them, possibly even the date of their death. So it was a constant reminder to them, a memorial to them, and it also sort of linked the people that received those gifts, and is a very common way for people to remember people in their will.
Is this distinct from the skull rings that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, so the skull, the death's head ring would have a skull on it, whereas these mourning rings were usually very often plain, but as I say, they might have on the inside have something engraved so that it had more personal meaning.
Do any of these mourning rings for Shakespeare, do any of them survive?
That's a really good question that I don't know the answer to. So obviously lots of mourning rings survive, but whether any one specific was specifically Shakespeare's ones, I don't know.
We don't know. Now, do we know who the executors of Shakespeare's will was? I note that Shakespeare's will was probated in the prerogative court of Canterbury as well. And I wonder why Canterbury instead of Warwickshire.
Yeah, so his executors were his eldest daughter and chief heir, Susanna Hall, and her husband, John Hall, who was a gentleman and physician. People often wonder why he doesn't appoint Anne as his executor, because many husbands did appoint their wife as their executor. But in this case, it seems like he was probably just trying to spare her all the bother of having to minister the will. So it was kind of a big responsibility to be made an executor. And given that Susanna was actually the chief heir, it probably made sense to appoint her. And Shakespeare also appointed 2 overseers. So these are 2 people that assist the executors and just help them out and help them with the responsibility. And that included Francis Collins, who was his lawyer. So somebody that would have been really well placed to help out and to help Susanna with sorting things out. So the will, was proved or probated in the prerogative court of Canterbury, which is confusingly named because it actually has nothing to do with the city of Canterbury. It's actually a court that is in London, which is the highest church court in England. So it deals with the ecclesiastical province of Canterbury, not just the city. So most people, if you didn't own much property, you could just use your local court or your county court. If you owned property in more than one bishopric, though, you had to resort to this highest court, the prerogative court of Canterbury, which was the highest church court in the land. And Shakespeare owned property both in Warwickshire, in Stratford-upon-Avon, and in London. So he therefore had property in 2 bishoprics, and he had to go to that high court, the PCC. So it's basically to do with jurisdiction.
How long is Shakespeare's will? And do we know when he wrote it? I think I asked this specifically because a lot of people assume that he was dying when he wrote his will. But you've mentioned in the preamble that he said he was of sound mind and body and didn't make reference to the I am sick of body, but sound of mind, the way that someone who was ill might have done. So was he dying, or did people have to be dying when they wrote their will, or would they write it just in preparation for some future eventuality?
Yeah, that's a good question. So his original will is 3 pages long, so 3 sides. It's dated the 25th of March, 1616, but there's actually been quite a lot of debate about when exactly it was written. So let me just kind of talk you through it. So the most recent study was by Amanda Bevin and David Foster, and they were able to use multispectral imaging, which basically allowed them to date the ink that was used on each of the different pages. And by doing this, they realized that actually the will had been through various different iterations, and that Shakespeare had probably written it and then updated it several times. So that obviously really complicates this question of when did he write his will, because he wrote it and then kept changing it. So we think now, and as I say, this is the recent study, they suggest that the original will was most likely written in April 1613, which is when Shakespeare bought his property in London, and that he then updated it in January 1616, which was the year he died. And that he did that because it was just before his daughter Judith got married. So therefore, personal circumstances had changed. He needed to change the provision that was made for Judith in his will. So you've got a 1613 will, which is then updated in 1616. And then it seems like Shakespeare probably fell dangerously ill in March 1616, which is obviously when he dies, or shortly afterwards he dies. So it was probably then that he made the final alterations to it, and he probably hastily added those smaller personal bequests of the bed and the rings. So these are personal mementos. They're the kinds of things that you bequeath to people as you are dying. You're kind of facing the prospect of your approaching death, and you're thinking about how you want people to remember you. So they're quite different bequests to those ones that just relate to property and what you want to have happen to your estate.
Shakespeare documented has information on wills stating that citizens of London in particular had to give their worldly goods away in assigned thirds, 1/3 of which was called the dead man's portion. Can you explain what this phrase means to us and how a bequest was different if you were a citizen of London as opposed to somewhere else?
Yeah, so this would be another area of this customary common law. And as mentioned, these customs often vary within regions, and it seems like what was happening in London was different to other places. So if you look at the rules that the citizens of London have to follow, according to their London's customary laws, a freeman has to leave at least 1/3 of his estate to his widow, 1/3 of his estate to his children, and then that remaining third is the dead man's portion. But it isn't entirely clear from the records that we have what happens to it. So it might be that that goes to the administrator of the will, or it might be that then that's just left to the discretion of the testator to choose what they'd like to do with it. But those were the kinds of specific rules for citizens of London, which might have been different if you looked somewhere else.
I know we would love to explore this history further. There's obviously tons to unpack and dive into here with the history of wills and testaments, and certainly even for Shakespeare's will and testament. As someone who has done a lot of research into this area, please tell us what are some of your favorite books or resources you can point us towards that would be a good place to begin if we want to learn more.
Well, I would have to say that a good place to start is the project website of the big project that I'm working on. So this is The Material Culture of Wills, England, 1540 to 1790. And the reason I say that is because we have a really lively blog where we basically post about the interesting wills that we come across. So we have a feature called Will of the Month, where we just pick an interesting will and talk about the different bequests and the relationships that we find in it. There's also a resources page on there. So it has lots of lists of further reading. So if you want to learn more about will making or bequests or material culture, there's lots of suggestions for reading in there, as well as just practical information about where to find wills, how to interpret the material that you see, and so on. So that's a very good place to start. I should also say that as part of that project, we're basically transcribing 25,000 English wills from the Prerogative Court of Canterbury. And as you can imagine, it's an enormous task. So what we're actually doing is we're asking volunteers to help us to complete those transcriptions. So if you go to our Zooniverse site, you can actually contribute directly to our research project by transcribing some wills for yourself. So you just get given little sentences from wills, and then you just have to write what it says. And there's also very active set of talk boards there, so you can talk to other volunteers, you can ask questions of the team. So if you find something particularly interesting, you can talk to us about it. If you like, you can also go onto the UK National Archive website, and you can there you can look at the digitised versions of the registered wills from the Prerogative Court of Canterbury. So you just have to register, and then you get some free downloads. And finally, I really would recommend that article by Amanda Bevan and David Foster on Shakespeare's will, which was the one where they dated the ink and then they worked out precisely when they thought he had written it, because it's just a really interesting and useful summary. And it also has a full diplomatic transcription at the end of Shakespeare's will, so you can read it and see what you think of it for yourself.
How exciting. You get to connect with other historians and contribute to helping this history continue to delight and inform us about the past, and straight from the place where Shakespeare's will is as well. How much fun. We will place links to all of these resources in the show notes for today's episode, so stay tuned for the URL for where to find those. We'll have all these recommendations organized nicely for you with direct links so you can go straight to the project that interests you most. Now, Laura, we asked everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those. And since I've been told the original Desert Island Discs also allows you a luxury item, I'm going to start adding this to this question now, but you may also select a luxury item if you wish.
Well, thank you. I mean, the complete works of Shakespeare in the Bible would keep me going for a long time, I think, because I am a historian of religion, so the Bible is right up my street. But I thought as my book, I'd choose something that would be completely different to that. So that I'd actually choose a little novel by Stephen King, which is called The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. And that's for various reasons, one of which is because Stephen King is just one of my favourite authors and a delight to read, but also because it's a story about a 9-year-old girl that gets lost in the woods and then has to survive on her own in a very hostile environment. So I thought I might get some tips from it, but also it'd be good for morale because, she does a good job of surviving. It's
motivating too. If a 9-year-old can live, I'll make it. It'll be fine.
Yeah, exactly. And part of the way that she survives is that she's a really big baseball fan. And indeed, I'm a really big baseball fan. Tom Gordon was a ball player, for those of you that know. So I thought if I couldn't watch the game, then at least I get to read about it in this book. So it combines lots of things that I love, which would be nice.
It's an excellent choice, I think. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, lots more wills. So we're only 1 year into our project. So my future does look like it's going to be very full of wills. But one of the things that I'm really excited about is that we're going to be joined next year by a creative practitioner. So this is a musician and a composer called Chris Hoban. And he's basically just going to be looking at the wills with us and kind of helping us to explore them, try to use different ways and more creative ways to think about them, and then think about how we might transform them by combining sort of historical and creative methods. So who knows what might come of that? It'd be really fun to see where it goes. And you can keep an eye on the project website if you want to find out.
That sounds fascinating. Who knew that there was all this to uncover in just a list of bequests? I have to say, I thought wills and testaments was going to be kind of a boring section of just, leave this to this person, this person, this person, but it's not at all. There's a fascinating amount of history to unpack here. And I know we are looking forward to seeing all of the methods that you use to bring them to life in the future. And thank you so much for being here to help us unpack exactly what they are and what they included and understand this bit of Shakespeare's history that much better. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you very much.
If you're as excited as I am to dive into the history of wills and testaments from the 16th and 17th century, then our show notes page is the best place to begin. Along with more information on Laura Sangha and her research, we have direct links to the resources she recommends for you today, including their Level Hume project on the material culture of wills in England from this time period, all organized for you at CassidyCash.com/episode 359. That's CassidyCash.com/EP359. And if you'd like access to the Patreon content, the bonus history of the visuals and primary documents, that URL is also the place to find the Patreon button to log in or join us as a patron to expand the extras. If you love the history you learn about here on the show and you want to go one step further to actually try out some of the history we talk about here on the podcast, then you will love Experience Shakespeare. Experience Shakespeare is our Patreon tier designed to let you try out games, recipes, and crafts straight from the 16th and 17th century, all of which you can complete at home or in your classroom with items you may already have on hand or can easily source from your local market or store. Each of our hands-on activity kits not only show you step-by-step how to complete the activity, but we outline for you where the activity coordinates with Shakespeare's plays and with specific episodes of our show. Find out more and dive in with your first hands-on activity at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife and click on Experience Shakespeare. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.